My name is Terry Ryan, and I am the Vice President for Ohio Programs and Policy for the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. As such, I'm actually based in Dayton, Ohio, and we do a lot of work in Columbus. So I guess I'm the state-level local guy, and my colleagues here are also going to be talking about local and state issues as it relates to incubation. I want to say thanks to my D.C. colleagues in the Fordham office, Checker, Mike Petrilli, and the whole Fordham team for all your help in setting this up. It's been fantastic. Thanks to you all for being here and finding your way through the Occupy D.C., or what do they call it here, Occupy D.C. or Occupy Wall Street? D.C., okay. Believe it or not, we have Occupy Dayton as well. I think a pretty small contingent in them, but I've walked by them a few times and had conversations with them. So it's really, I just want to say thanks to all of you for being here and say it's a privilege for us at Fordham to host this event. This is different than I think what we normally do, and that this emerged from our efforts at the state level and the local level, as I mentioned. And it's a partnership that we have been doing with CEE-Trust, and Ethan is going to say more about CEE-Trust. But it's just a privilege to have you all here. And to turn it over to Brian and the panel, and I'm now going to turn it over to Ethan.
Thanks, Terry, and thanks everybody for coming today. My name is Ethan Gray. I'm the Vice President of the Mind Trust and the Director of the Cities for Education Entrepreneurship Trust, or CEE-Trust for short. The Mind Trust is an Indianapolis-based nonprofit that supports education, innovation, and reform, and we founded CEE-Trust in 2010 as a way to convene other city-focused education reform leaders in a conversation about how to accelerate change at the city level. We are thrilled to have a growing network of 18 members, including mayors, locally focused foundations, and nonprofits. We are trying to find ways to facilitate collaborations and share best practices and lessons learned. And one of the conversations we've been having recently is a conversation about how we are trying to support the smart growth of the charter sector in respective member cities. We are so glad you're joining us here today to talk about charter school incubation. A number of our members are working on incubation as a promising strategy for accelerating the growth of the charter market. And I also wanted to point out, aside from the wonderful panelists we have today, we have a number of other CEE-Trust members with us. Debbie Dorden from Innovative Schools in Delaware is here. Amy Slothauer from Get Smart Schools in Colorado is here as well. Justin Testerman from the Tennessee Charter School Incubator in the back there. And Mike McGee from the Rhode Island Mayoral Academies is here. So we're going to have a small reception afterwards. Please feel free to stick around and get to know those folks. We're going to have some fruit and veggies and beer. I don't know how about that combo is going to work, but it's the end of the day. So anyway, thank you all for coming today. I'm going to turn it over to Brian Hassel now.
Great. Thanks, Ethan. I'm going to give an overview of this topic, charter school incubation. And before we go to our great panel here, which includes Nirav Kingsland from New Schools for New Orleans, Al Fan from Charter School Partners in Minnesota, and Patrick Harrell from the Mind Trust's Charter Incubator in Indianapolis. So we're going to have a great panel discussion. I'm going to start by giving an overview of this topic and really drawing heavily on the report that was released today by Fordham and CEE-Trust called Better Choices about charter school incubation. So I commend you to read that, pick up that report. And I also want to acknowledge the report's authors, Joa Bleidinger and Julie Cole, who aren't here today but really deserve the kudos for preparing the document. So there's all this debate about charter schools in the country, but there's little doubt that there are some charter schools that are truly knocking it out of the park, getting exceptional results with students who a lot of people would say didn't have much chance of success before those schools came along. But these schools serve far too few students relative to the need. If you think of the top 10% of charter schools in the country, the ones that really are getting these exceptional results, they serve fewer than 200,000 students around the country. Now, some of them have formed charter management organizations that are trying to scale up and serve more students, but the growth is not what we need. So the average CMO, according to research by Mathematica and Center on Reinventing Public Education, is adding just one school a year to its network. And only 5 of the national charter management organizations ever plan to have more than 30 schools. So the growth rate of great charter schools is just far below what's needed, considering there are 400 and some thousand students on charter school waiting lists. And of course, there are millions of students, especially disadvantaged students, that need better options. So we have a kind of desperate need as a nation to grow charter school spaces more rapidly than we are growing them. And so many communities around the country are thinking, how can we have more great charter school spots? And they'd like to recruit these national CMOs like KIPP and others to come to their communities, but that's a limited strategy. And so many communities are turning to this idea of charter school incubation. They're saying, how can we grow our own great charter schools from leaders that we find here in our communities and have them add more and more charter school spaces over time that are excellent? And that's the idea of charter school incubation. Now, particularly when we talk about charter school incubation in this report, we're focusing on a particular breed of efforts that are going on around the country. And they're represented by the three groups on this panel, as well as the others that Ethan recognized. Now, all of these have some common characteristics. They're very selective. They're looking for very high caliber leaders in the community who can step forward and have a high potential to start great schools. They're very intensive. They're providing a lot of funding, investment, and possibly support and training to these leaders so that they can be as effective as possible. So it's a big investment, not a kind of light touch support. And then finally, they're really holding themselves accountable for the success of the schools that come out of these efforts. So these are their schools that they've taken responsibility for incubating and hatching, and so it's on them whether these schools are successful or not. So it's an interesting set of organizations that we're seeing and calling charter school incubators. And you're seeing some early success. So in New Schools for New Orleans, for example, that organization incubated the highest performing high school and the highest performing elementary school in the entire New Orleans Recovery School District. In Colorado, Get Smart Schools has incubated 11 of the 12 schools that they've incubated are outperforming the state in student growth, and they're incubating schools in tough neighborhoods in Denver and other places. And so there's some great early success stories, certainly not a lot of research and evidence beyond these early success stories, but a lot of reason to think this is a very promising strategy. I'm not going to say much more now about what incubators do because we're going to hear from the panelists about what they do. The report contains profiles of incubators around the country. I'd also recommend another report that we worked on with CEE-Trust called Incubating High-Quality Charter Schools, Innovations in City-Based Organizations that was published by the National Charter School Resource Center, which also provides a lot of information about what incubators do. What I really want to focus my remarks on for a few minutes here, though, is how can policymakers foster charter school incubation? So what can policymakers do to incubate more great charter schools? And perhaps the most direct and impactful thing policymakers could do is find ways to allocate public funding to this activity. And that's what I want to talk mostly about. But before I go there, of course, there's lots of other ways that policymakers can make the world a good place for incubation by shaping the environment in which incubators operate and in which charter schools operate. So things like eliminating charter caps. So there's a high bar for new approvals, but no artificial limit on the number of charter schools. Closing or restructuring bad charter schools, because there's nothing more poisonous to an environment where you want to create high-quality charter schools than the presence of a lot of ineffective charter schools. Funding charter schools equitably, both for operations and for facilities and capital. Providing charter schools with the autonomy that they're promised in the charter school bargain or in trade for accountability. And then streamlining the approval process for charter schools that have proven themselves successful and want to scale up. So there's lots of policies like that that would be helpful. But what I want to zero in on is the idea of providing some kind of public funding for the incubation activity itself. And if you think about public funding for charter schools and for schools in general, the vast majority of it goes for the operations of schools. That once a school is open, paying for it to operate on a day-to-day basis. It's very rare to see policymakers carving out a portion of the vast sum of funds we spend on public education, carving out a portion and saying, this we're going to invest in innovation, this we're going to invest in some kind of new starts. But that's what we're talking about here. Most of the funding that's come from for incubation has come from private philanthropy, which have invested substantial sums. But if you think about the need and the scale of the need, it's hard to imagine having the kind of incubation effort that we need as a nation without public funding being devoted to it in some way. And I think the good news for policymakers is that incubation in its early stages here looks like a pretty good investment. For one thing, it's not that big of an expense on the front end. Incubation, according to the research we've done, is costing $200,000 to $500,000 school, and it's a one-time investment which, if successful, pays off for years on end and perhaps pays off for more and more students over time if you incubate schools that end up growing and serving more students. And so compare that $200,000 to $500,000 to the vast sums that we're spending through the school improvement grants, for example, where schools are getting about $2.5 million per school over 3 years for various kinds of turnaround efforts. So relative to some other investments that are similarly focused, incubation is relatively inexpensive and looks like it has a pretty high payoff rate relative to some other strategies. And so how could public funding flow for incubation? I think one positive development is the proliferation of these organizations that focus on incubation, which could be good vehicles for public investment because they already have apparatus set up to vet applicants and make good decisions and then support incubating organizations over time. But in this day and age with the fiscal crisis that we're in, where could funding come from for an activity like this? And the report has several ideas, but let me just run through 4 or 5 of them, and then we're going to go from that to the panel. First, we could find ways to use the existing charter school program more effectively to support incubation. There's already a program called the Charter School Program that supports the startup of charter schools. It tends to be widely spread within states. It tends to support charter schools in their early years, but perhaps a portion of it could be repurposed in a way that supports this early stage incubation that's very selective and intense and produces these high quality schools. So that's one possibility. A similar possibility is rethinking how the school improvement grants work in a way that supports incubation. The school improvement grants offer schools several options for improving if they're failing schools, one of which is restarting under the operation of an outside operator, and yet this is a very infrequently used option because there's a real dearth of supply of operators that are actually willing and able to do this. So what if there was a way to repurpose some of the vast sums we're spending on SIG into incubation, create that pipeline, which then could pay off over time in those schools? A third idea is within states to redirect other education funding into incubation. If policymakers think incubation is a valuable activity, they could carve out a relatively small percentage of education funding in a state and devote it to incubation. It wouldn't take much. Yes, it would mean finding savings elsewhere, whether that's in administrative functions that aren't valuable or programs that need to be ended because they aren't working. But given the likely return on investment, it would make a lot of sense for a state to think about restructuring its overall funding system in a way that just carves off a small portion for incubation. And then finally, states could consider some kind of tax credit for investments in incubation. States already have many kinds of tax credits that support different sorts of business growth within states, and even within education that support private school scholarship funds and other sorts of educational investments. What if they also offer tax credits for donations to efforts to incubate charter schools? That would be a cost for states, but again, given the return that we're seeing from some of these early efforts, would really be worth considering. And it's a matter of priority for policymakers. Policymakers have the habit of spending most of the education money on the ongoing operations of schools and then hoping for results to improve. What about pulling out some of that funding, making it available for incubation as an investment that ought to pay off in the future? Now I'm going to stop there. There's more ideas about how public funding could support incubators in the report, but let me stop with those and let me go to the panel because I think we'd love to hear from each of you about what you're doing in your community. Give a brief overview of, starting with Nirav, of what's happening in your incubation, what kind of activity are you undertaking, what sort of results you're seeing, and then we're going to have a discussion up here for a while and then go out to the audience for questions and answers. So why don't we hear from New Orleans first? What's going on there with incubation?
Great, thanks, Brian. So our organization, New Schools for New Orleans, has gone through 2 phases of incubation, so I'll walk through both of those phases. And the first thing, Brian was very kind to talk about our successes, but I want to be upfront about our failures too. So in our first wave of incubation, we launched, depending on how you cut it, roughly 10 schools. Out of those 10, 2 of them are the highest performing schools in the city, and we're thrilled about the successes of those schools. One of them we're currently reinvesting in to become a CMO, so we're seeing a multiplier effect on our first round of incubation. One of them actually is likely today to get their charter revoked for underperformance, and there's another one that next year might. And then there's schools in the middle. Some are outperforming the district, some are a little under. So we had a pretty mixed portfolio. Overall, we increased the quality relative to the district, but there's risk involved, and I would hope that if we did the exact same strategy again, we'd learn and those percentages would go up a little higher. But incubation has risks in it, and it has failures in it, and if you don't go in understanding that, you're going to be in for some surprise. But you're also not being aggressive enough, in my mind, if there's no failure involved at all. The second piece that makes New Orleans interesting is fairly early on, our incubation was tied to a city strategy. And so you can maybe think of two types of incubation. One is when the charter people are over on the side, they're sneaking around, opening one or two schools here and there and slowly building pressure on the system. And there's another type of incubation strategy when the charter folks and the district folks are working together on a unified vision of what the system should look like. And in the New Orleans case, that was creating the nation's first charter school district. 79% of students right now attend charter schools in New Orleans. That's going to get up to 85, 90, 95 over the next couple of years. And so we worked very closely with government, and which was a pretty radical shift. The one-liner about New Orleans and how it's changing the game is it's changing the role of government. It's changing the role of government from an operator of schools to a regulator of schools. So the government is setting the rules. It's saying who can open and who can close, but it's not in the day-to-day. And so our incubation fit well contextually with where the whole city was heading, and I think that added a lot when there were successes. It was often had to do with the environment we were in. As I said before, the first phase we were doing standalone charter schools. We were taking generally young entrepreneurs, getting them off the ground, and we weren't looking for scale right away. We were looking for proof points and building a very immature charter market. About a year and a half ago, we changed our incubation strategy, seeing that we'd had some successes, but also a decent amount of failure, and we were in a high-risk endeavor when you're doing these fresh startups. And, the private sector is no different. Startups are going to have failures. We shifted most of our resources into replication. So our first 3 to 4 years were about 80% startup, 20% replication. As our charter market matured and we had more to invest in, we started scaling what had been working. So I mentioned our top school we're investing to become a CMO. There are a couple others in the city that were doing well. We still want to keep the new startups going on some level. We like to say the next KIP's going to form somewhere, and we want them to form in New Orleans. So we're keeping innovation going, but our more steady state incubation investment strategy is probably going to be around 80% replication, 20% startup. But I think it takes a while for a charter market to get there, and 5 to 6 years in, New Orleans is getting there, and that's kind of where we're at right now.
All right, Al, you want to share some about Minnesota?
Thanks, Brian. Charter School Partners, first of all, is a relatively young nonprofit in the state. And let me just start by saying some of the things that we do have. We have the oldest charter school law in the country. We have the best charter school law in the country. We have strong funding for charter schools. We have bipartisan support in our legislature. What we don't have are enough high-quality charter schools to close the achievement gap. And we early on realized that a good-to-great strategy was just not going to be enough. We want to work with the existing charter schools to continue to improve their performance, but we realized that if we're going to have an impact on the system, if we're going to reach that tipping point in the district, so to speak, we needed to rapidly scale high-quality charters. And so our two-pronged approach of quality and scale led us to this effort to incubate new charter schools with a focus on high-quality charter schools that are closing the achievement gap in a very narrow geographic zone. I think all of those things are important to this formula, and if we're successful, we feel like it will have an impact on the district policies, it'll have an impact on funding, it'll have an impact on community support as well. The incubation program that we launched is a fellowship program, and I should be clear that our fellowship is one prong of our startup effort. We're also trying to attract national and regional charter management organizations to come to Minnesota. We're also focused on replication. But we also think that fellowships, or doing our own, if you will, is one of the strategies we have to pursue. We couldn't rely on the market to sort of create their own high-performing schools. We have a lot of strong charter schools, but there's also a lot of specialization. And if we wanted to create a large enough critical mass of high-performing schools in the city, we felt we had to do that ourselves. And so our fellowship is relatively new, just started this July. We have our first 2 fellows going through the program. It's a 2-year program. The first year, we pay them a stipend and put them in a residency program for the year. And then the second year, they pay for their own way. But it's designed as a 2-year comprehensive program with the end result being new charter schools. So our first cohort will open their schools in 2013. This next year, we'll start with 3 more, and then 3 more after that.
Okay, great. And then Indianapolis. So the work that the Mind Trust is doing in Indianapolis actually didn't start at all connected to charter schools. We got our start trying to work to bring entrepreneurship in education reform into the city. And the first iteration of that was through a fellowship that we created that invested about $250,000 into someone who wanted to start a new venture in Indianapolis that would work in K-12 education and have some sort of profound impact on the opportunities that students got in Indianapolis. And we had a lot of success bringing in some really fantastic talent into the city as a result. Celine Coggins was one of our fellows who started Teach Plus. Earl Phelan started Summer Advantage in Indianapolis, and it's spread and been really successful. I think our next generation was to look at what are some of the national, highly successful programs that are doing the same sorts of transformative work. And so we worked to then bring in Teach for America and the New Teacher Project, College Summit, Stand for Children recently, to build the capacity of the leadership pipeline and the entrepreneurs who are bringing innovation in education. And so then I guess I start with that because I don't think we could have started to think about charter school incubation with that foundation not in place in Indianapolis. And I think then we were in a really fortunate position because of CEE-Trust and the partnerships that we had with New Schools for New Orleans and learning from what Al Fan was doing to start to think about how we should think about innovation and charter school incubation. And the approach that we've decided to take is taking the successes that Nirev, for example, has seen in New Orleans and saying, how can we think about bringing in really strong schools, really high-class public charter schools, but do so in a way that's going to be quickly scalable and do so in a way that's going to be, for the first time really in Indianapolis, bring in really high-quality networks and perhaps seed the next KIPP, for example. And so our approach has been to offer $1 million award, and in fact, we've got several lined up for the 2012 year, for teams of individuals that intend to start networks of charter schools. Of course, they'll start with a single charter school, but our thought was, how can we give folks time and money on the front end so that they can invest not only setting up a successful first school, but also once that school is successful, be in a position to quickly replicate. I will be the first to say we are new to this incubation game, and we are taking a lot of our cues from some of our CEE-Trust partners who have seen a lot of success and like you mentioned, seen a lot of failures as well. But we're really excited to bring in and really create that local network of highly successful schools.
So Patrick gave a sense of the approach you're taking, this $1 million prize. We heard a little bit from Al about the way they've structured their program as a 2-year fellowship, which I believe you developed this program yourselves as a new program that
we did. It is new for Minnesota, but we did study existing programs around the country. We took some lessons from the Kip Fisher Fellowship Program, New Schools for New Orleans, Building Excellent Schools. I mean, there are some existing models, and I think we try to assemble the best practices from each.
And then in New Orleans, you've had a different approach to how you support your incubating schools. Can you say a little bit about how you've gotten that done, the support part?
Sure. So the support part's really tricky, and depending on how you structure it, we chose not to take a board seat on the schools we were incubating. So once the school opened, it was its own entity, and we had soft power, potentially a little money as a carrot. But thinking about how you structure that relationship on the front end is very important, and being very clear on expectations, which we probably weren't as clear as we should be. Should have been. What we went into once a school opened was a school review cycle. So very quickly after the school opened, we spent a full day in the school giving feedback, observing classrooms, writing up a report for the school leader that listed the top priority things to change. Then we did a coaching model, about a once-a-week coaching model through the school year based on that initial review. And then we did another full-day review at the end of the year. I think it worked as well as support can work. And in some cases, we did see a lot of gains. What we generally saw is that it was our schools that were doing well that actually had their growth accelerated by the support. The schools that were struggling, we did not see change because of the support. So I think your big front-end battle is really on selection. That's probably 70% of the game on some level. Of the folks you select, your top half can probably gain a lot by support, and it's worth reinvesting in them. But you do have to be careful because you can easily get sucked in spending all your time and resources on the folks who are struggling the most. So it takes a lot of discipline. One of the schools that I talked about that's getting their charter revoked, we actually, in a year and a half into that school's life cycle, we went to the board and recommended school leader change. So we were very willing, for lack of better words, to eat our own and be very disciplined about closing our own and pushing our own and shifting resources so the folks who are doing great could expand. And it took us a little while to build that discipline, but that's where we ended up.
I'd be interested to hear any of you address the question of why focus on this strategy, charter incubation, versus the many things that you could be doing. You're all in some ways general purpose education reform organizations. You could do a lot of things. Why focus on this among other possibilities?
So one of the things I've learned in my short time in this work is that education is local. It really is about how the school fits into the community, the need of the community it's trying to serve, the local funders, the local politics, the local businesses. And so it sort of, we could have gone out and tried to attract national organizations, more national organizations to come into the state. But at some point you have to realize, or we realize, I guess, that we needed to Minnesotaize, whatever we did. And every state, every community is unique and different, and I think what we've learned is that we play a role by being the incubator. We are able to help bridge the gap between best practices and organizations that want to do this great charter school work and the local community. And I feel like the added value that we bring to the process is not just helping them understand the local laws, the local community members who might be a good board member, but it's really immersing them in the community and helping them to understand what it takes to make a successful school in a particular, even a neighborhood. And again, the other reason is we could have let the market work. We could have used a laissez-faire approach and sort of let community groups get together, but we felt that if we wanted to accelerate the scale process, we had to direct this process ourselves.
Yeah, it's interesting that you started with the idea of local, because my answer was going to be because of Indianapolis. Really, more than anything was what drove our strategy into charter incubation, because just at the last Indiana legislative session, the laws were thrown open for charter schools in Indiana. It now is in a place where it is a really terrific state to think about charter schools. And currently in Indiana, there are about 60 charter schools statewide, and we really are on this door of lots and lots of new charter schools coming into Indiana, and that's really exciting. But I think unless we have a really critical eye toward quality and that selection piece that you mentioned that is so critically important, that open door policy and that influx of charter schools isn't going to be directed in the way that will have the biggest impact. And so in our Indianapolis and Indiana context, this was the perfect time to start thinking about how we can play a role in bringing a particularly high level of quality of charter schools into Indianapolis. And I think specifically as we started to look around at charter schools across the country, we saw very consistently that the quality almost invariably came from regionalized networks. I would point to Yes Prep, I would point to IDEA, I would point to Noble Street up in Chicago as being these creators of consistently high-performing schools. And to a very limited degree, Indiana does not, and Indianapolis specifically, does not have these regionalized networks. And so I think that combination of the legislative landscape and our opportunity to play a role in creating that consistent quality by doing some incubation work was just really exciting.
I think for us, and so on my walk over here, like you guys have probably you all walked by the occupiers. And I think, if I have my history correct, they started because of the bank bailouts, Occupy Wall Street. I think you could make an argument that the bigger bailout that is happening in our country right now is the amount of money going into underperforming districts. It is just dollar after dollar being, in my mind, in many ways wasted, going into dysfunctional institutions that aren't meeting their mission of serving children. And that bailout, to me, is, I think, why the charter community formed and why we're trying to divert a minuscule amount of funds, when you think of how much money is being spent, into new organization creation rather than bailing out failing organizations. And that's where you're going to see improvement. That's where you're going to see growth. You know, how many more decades of underperforming urban districts do we need to see before we start devoting resources to coming up with something new? And that's really what we've done in New Orleans, again, is we're pushing out the traditional system of district-run schools, and we're getting entrepreneurs and folks launching excellent charter schools to drive the growth. It's going to be a bumpy road as we get there. But the thing is, when a charter school hits, when, you know, the two we launched, who are the top two in the city, they're going to be around for a while. And if we're aggressive about going after the bottom and supporting the ones at the top, if you run that cycle and keep on running it, for a lack of better word, because you don't want to minimize the impact that turnaround can have on kids, you're going to churn your way to excellence over time. Our organization takes the view, we got a federal innovation grant to turn around the bottom 5% of schools every year. The math is pretty simple there. If you do that over 5 years, you have 25%. Over 10 years of consistent but manageable charter growth at 5% a year, any urban district could potentially transform the bottom half of their schools. So really, again, taking this charter incubation strategy and tying it to a greater vision for what in our case, our city, New Orleans, could become, and I hope what the country can become, is a much more entrepreneurial urban markets. And to do that, you need resources, you need groups who can build up some competencies in helping schools get off the ground.
So can I add, I mean, in Minnesota, one of the things we say is that we have a pretty good system of choice in our state. What we really need to do is transform that into a system of good choices for parents and families. And our theory of change is that we need to build enough of these high-performing schools that parents start to realize what it looks like and that it can be done in our own backyard. And it's not, we never have said that charters are the solution to improving all of public education, but hopefully they can provide a catalyst and examples for districts and other examples of choice to follow.
So when you doing this work, what are some of the toughest challenges? What makes it hard to do well? What makes it hard to get the results that you're seeking? Or what do you anticipate in your case, Patrick, being the toughest part?
Yeah. It's really, really hard work. And I mean, for the incubator itself, it's disingenuous to say our work's hard. Launching a charter school is extremely hard work. When we were training our founders, the only thing we could compare it to was being a general live fire. I mean, there are people's lives on the line, and you are going to get so many things thrown at you, you can't even imagine. And by the way, you're 28 and probably have never led adults anyways. So what folks are going through is just incredibly, incredibly difficult. People are working, easily 80-hour weeks. It's going to be your life for the first 3 to 4 years. And you have to go into it with that mentality. I think when people talk, when I say these things, the next question is, well, what about burnout? And I think part of this is changing our expectations of what it takes to achieve excellence. I've never heard anybody say, well, maybe doctors should start working a little less hard. Or that whole residency thing where they work really hard for 3 years, we need to get rid of that because that's just too much on people. I think watching what charter founders do is humbling in how hard they're working, but it's gratifying, and that's what it should be about. People should be devoting their lives to doing excellent schools, and anything that's hard, you're going to have failure. So it's really changing the game of moving education and the work of education into the same high performance, high pressure environments that I think it takes to achieve excellence in any field.
I think what it boils down to for us is basically high quality talent and funding. On the talent side, it's sort of a catch-22. I think what we realize is that we have to start building more and more of these high quality charter schools because they become incubators of new talent for future charter schools. And if you don't have enough of them to sort of build that pipeline of both high quality teachers and school leaders, you're really starting from scratch. And so building the talent pool has been our biggest challenge. And initially we're recruiting leaders from outside of Minnesota to try to attract as large a crowd as possible and to get the best leaders for our schools. And then on the funding side, I think the system historically has never, the system historically has not supported early planning for charters. I mean, there's money in the pre-operational period just before you open the doors, and then there's state money once you open the doors. But what we're really talking about is developing leaders 24 months, 18 months ahead of opening the doors so that they do it right. And that's where I think the funding shortage has been most obvious. And we're using private funding to sort of make up the difference. But as Brian said earlier, it would be ideal and I think important for there to be public funding as well, because I think creating great schools is probably more important than creating a biotech zone or a technology corridor sometimes in a city.
Talent. I mean, you guys said it, and I guess I predicted that would be the case, and I'm terrified at how right I clearly am. I think when I think about the way we're structuring our incubator, we are looking for folks not only who we think would be able to run one school, in which case you might be able to take some calculated risks on some greener leaders, but we're looking for folks who will be able to take on leadership of a network of schools, and that implies a level of operational and people management experience that just requires more life and work experience. And so finding those folks, most of whom have terrific jobs already and would be needing to take a risk to do something that is so, like you said, rewarding and important, but so difficult. That really is the key to our success. And very much of the model that we've come up with, which is based on the fellowship that we've seen, is that we can labor over what kinds of support we give to our fellows, but really if we select the right people on the front end and then respond to what they need, that's going to lead to better outcomes. And so we're not trying to script a curriculum for folks to go through. We're going to create a support that will respond to them, but it all does depend on the talent.
So on the funding question, how are you funding this work? Where is the money coming from to do this in your cities now?
We'd like to thank the federal government, if any of you all are here. Our first round of funding came from philanthropy. About 75% of it was national, 25% local, which is an issue because that's not scalable. Obviously, New Orleans was in the spotlight, and those funds came in from national funding sources. Since then, we've built our local fundraising a little more, but it's not where it needs to be. The second thing, and I really commend the feds in doing this, was the Invest in Innovation funds that we got. We got a $33 million grant. That was to do 19 schools in New Orleans and also to spread the work to Tennessee. So we're supporting the great folks, Justin's here, and Chris Barbick at the Achievement School District, and launching schools in Memphis and Nashville at this point. And obviously I'm biased here, but I couldn't imagine a better use of federal funds. And in some way, the charter incubation strategy, it's a larger part of a deregulation effort. You're trying to get power back down to educators and kind of get government bureaucrats out of that. And I think the feds are often in a very good place to incentivize that. It's very hard for the local government itself to break itself apart. You do have some visionary superintendents like Joel Klein or John White who have explicitly said this is what they want to do. But you can understand it's a hard position to take if you're the head of your local district. So I think this is an incredibly useful way for the federal government to spend their money, and they're very well positioned to do it in a way other entities aren't.
So we would like to have some federal funding. But right now, all of our work is being funded by a combination of local and national philanthropists. And Brian, you quoted those numbers that it's 200 to 500,000 per school. When we look at what it takes to open a school, there's the planning work that I talked about up front to develop the leadership, and then there's the startup money that is available through philanthropic sources. So Minnesota is currently a Tier 2 state for the Walton Family Foundation, and we are able to get some startup money for charter schools, and that's in that pre-operational year after they've been authorized. And then the federal CSP grant money is on top of that, and that's typically right before opening through the first 3 years of opening. So all of that money goes into opening a high-performing school, and I think when I say we're raising money, it really is to add that incremental planning dollars up front. And for us, we pay our fellows a stipend for 1 year while they're in their school residencies and helping them develop their business plan, their instructional plan, their authorizer applications. That first year we're paying the stipend, and that's only for us a total of about $100,000 incremental spending into the system. And then after that, we expect them to get either a Walton grant or some other grant, and we expect them to get the federal CSP money as well. And if any of those pieces fall out, it makes it much more challenging.
We're in a pretty lucky place right now with the idea of incubation, because I really do think it's attracted a lot of excitement in Indianapolis. And in fact, the original two funders for our program, we have a very generous amount of support from local Fairbanks Foundation, which has been phenomenal. But for the actual $1 million prizes, Eli Lilly and Company, Indianapolis's largest corporate employer, decided they would fund one of the prizes, a full $1 million. And then shortly thereafter, the mayor of Indianapolis dedicated $2 million of the city's funds. Now, that is pending city county council approval, so we are still crossing our fingers for that. But that level of corporate and public support for this idea of incubation and bringing in new, great, innovative public charter schools, I think that signal that the city is sending is, if I were someone thinking about applying, would be really exciting to say, I'm thinking about going to a city that is behind this idea. And very recently, and we are soon to announce very generous support from a national foundation to further our work that we're just thrilled about. And so I think that signal that has been sent, and really, I mean, I know we're going to get into this idea of funding, but that is being sent in Indiana is really quite remarkable. I mean, just this year, it was announced that the Indiana Department of Education was going to launch an Indiana Innovation Fund. It's about $2.5 million that they are opening up to anyone who wants to apply for these grants, 2-year grants, to do kind of whatever they want to apply for. And again, in full disclosure, the Mind Trust did apply for one of these innovation funds. But again, it's this really exciting signal that the state of Indiana and Indianapolis is excited about this idea of changing the way we educate and provide options for students in public schools.
Nirav, in thinking about the public funding you already are receiving, the federal funding, which obviously you're very pleased about, are there any lessons out of that you think would be helpful to policymakers thinking more generally about funding incubation? I mean, for example, one of the things that just comes to mind is the way that grant is working is the federal government is giving you, New Schools for New Orleans, a grant, and then you are the intermediary that is the one deciding who gets the incubation funding. It's not a direct federal decision, we're going to incubate this school or that school. That seems like one interesting aspect of it.
I think Arnie Duncan has better things to do than
Probably.
pick which school in New Orleans should get funded. I think, well, this brings up 2 points that I think Al mentioned that are really important. I think what's the role of the incubator. First, this is very local work. You're going to know the entrepreneurs. You're going to be the one finding them, getting them ready to apply. The second is there's a major timing issue. If you want to give money to charter schools, by definition, the charter school has to exist. What we know, though, is it takes a year or two of planning to get to the place where you're usually applying for authorization, and that's where traditionally philanthropy, Walton, Broad, and others have come in. But that's not really sustainable. If we want to scale this and create vibrant charter markets across the country, we can't keep on relying on philanthropy. So what the government really needs to get into is the year -1 and year -2. Now there's a tricky part here, again, that the government's not going to know who to fund year -1, year -2, because they haven't gone through charter authorization, which is the government's way of figuring out who's good or not. So the incubator is a thoughtful and useful way to solve that problem, where you give that money to an intermediary whose job it is then to find the entrepreneur, train them for a year or two, get them authorized. And if you're setting this up long term, and if you're building these funding streams long term, you can hold the incubators accountable. And based on their results of 3-4 years down the road, what their schools are doing, you can give them more or less funds. My vision, if we're really going to get to scale here, it just can't be the 3 people at this table and a couple other people in the room who are doing this. We need incubators all over the country. To be honest, we probably need competing incubators in the same cities, in the same geographies to get this going. The way, how many venture capital firms do you have in Silicon Valley? A ton. We need to get that way with charter incubation, charter startup, and we're just far from doing that. But again, the timing and the local talent seems to indicate that you need a solution in some form like this, where the government is giving funds to an intermediary rather than picking the winners and losers itself that early stage.
And one of my thoughts here, and I'd love to get your reactions, because again, we are new to this idea of incubation, and so this is just kind of an idea that I've had in my head. But we keep talking about this idea of the importance of local. And one of the functions that I think having a middleman who is local and regarded and known is that local entity becomes the imprimatur of quality, the insurer of quality, that it signals to the community that this is going to be a great school, and community members are able to rally behind that. And I would imagine that would be really important. It's something I'm thinking a lot about in Indianapolis. How can I make sure that the folks we bring in, whether they're from Indianapolis, whether they're from somewhere else nationally, we can connect them to the community in a way that's going to set them up for success. And I imagine you all, that's a hugely important role that you have been playing already.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. It comes in for us in a couple of different ways. One's on a pure advocacy. If somebody, especially if they're coming from out of the city, how to navigate the politics to secure a facility, get through authorization, all those things, for better or for worse, are political monsters in some sort or another. And having people who have those connections just helps. The second thing is also in helping the organization itself grow. Board members is one key thing, where if a local entity can connect entrepreneurs to great board members, it can help set them up on the right path. So I think there are key, for a lack of a better term, we call it cartilage functions that can help connect entrepreneurs with funders, with the government, and with business community and community and church organizations as well.
So I started off by saying that our two-pronged strategy was both quality and scale, and I think you're right. We couldn't do the work we're doing without being recognized as a standard bearer for high quality academic outcomes. I think that for too long now we've had a proliferation of choice, and what we want to do is add the quality component back into the conversation, so that's choice and quality. And I think it's been a slow change of mindset. We're not trying to stifle innovation, but we are trying to put more emphasis on high quality outcomes, because if we don't do that, we can build all the schools we want and it won't do us any good.
Yeah. And to call out the obvious, I think that requires each individual incubator the willingness to take on that risk, right? Because that let's say 8 of your 10 first schools that you incubated were terribly unsuccessful. New schools for New Orleans would not exist today, most likely. And so I think your idea of competitive incubators within one city, it certainly makes sense, because ultimately that incubator does have to accept that risk.
Sure.
All right. Any other thoughts from the panelists about helpful public policies? We're in Washington. Helpful actions from the federal government. Before we go out to the audience and see what's on the audience's mind, I want to give anyone a chance to give a final, not a final thought, but near final.
Well, I guess I would just add that as we've done this work around incubation, it needs to be included and incorporated into a much broader education reform sort of platform, right? It can't stand alone. Building schools in isolation is important, but it can't be the only thing. You have to do things to build a pipeline of talent. You have to create the environment of support and funding. You need business support. You need political support. You need philanthropy support. You need to do things to promote the closure of low-performing schools, because it needs to be part of this sort of ecosystem. We don't want to just close a school for the sake of closing it. We want to close a school if we can give the families in that community a better option, a better school that can deliver better results. And so we want to keep this sort of alive, and all of that is part of a large platform, and it's not just one thing in isolation.
Mm-hmm. And what I've found that's been exciting, though, is that having that initial conversation about the idea of an incubator as a possible strategy, oftentimes, in my experience, has opened the doors to those other questions that are necessary. I mean, one classic example is having this conversation about incubation in Indianapolis has started a broader conversation about things like funding formulas for public schools, and do we need to think more critically about how that is done and how that needs to change. And so, Al, I think you're right that this needs to be in a context of a larger conversation, but incubation can cause some of those other conversations to happen.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I think if you're one of the 5 people who reads my occasional blogging, which I've just started doing, which is a ton of fun, I wrote one which was talking about trying to change the framework and the mentality of which government approaches education funding. And it's a shift from funding programs, saying curriculum X works, and scaling that. You know, there's a lot of talk about scale. We need to scale this program or this program. And instead of scaling programs, scaling markets. And the idea there is that the government's probably not in the best position to scale a specific program. And 3 years down the road, that program might be proven not to work, and then you've wasted a bunch of money and so forth. So the government thinking about how can we create functioning, well-regulated markets and put our money into that, because once the market's created, the local entrepreneurs can go forth, build great solutions that we didn't even know existed, and they'll be working on problems we didn't even know existed. So as much as the government can think about shifting their funding that way, I think we'll all be better off. And market's probably a wonky word for the real thing we're doing, which is taking power back to parents and educators. You're creating environments where parents have choice and they can choose from options, and educators are the one who are driving decisions. And I think incubation is one example of a way to create markets that then give power back to parents and educators. There's obviously other ways you can do that, but the more the government is pulling its money out of just formulaic-driven things to support failing institutions and creating the new wave of schools, the better off kids will be.
All right, let's go out to the audience. I'm sure folks have questions and comments. I think there's, as Ethan said, there's several other people in the audience that are doing similar work in other cities, so that we might have some other perspectives from other places. But please identify yourself and tell us what's on your mind or ask a question. Nelson.
Nelson Smith, consultant. You were all talking about the local nature of this, and I agree that it's very important that this be locally centered. But just this morning, Nirav, I was reading about the intense, feelings in the community that so many community-based applications have not actually made it through the pipeline and been approved in Louisiana. And I wonder if that rings a bell with the other panelists, first of all, whether this is a common problem and whether maybe a very different set of strategies is necessary to bring folks who are, indigenous community members up to the bar so that they're ready to submit a successful application. I wonder if you could all comment on that.
Yeah. All right, starting with the high heat. This is good. It's, so the quick context in Louisiana is in New Orleans over the past 5 years. There have been charter applications that have often been driven by alumni groups. So folks who graduated from high schools that in their heyday were pretty successful. You'll see the class of 65, the class of 64. They know their high school is struggling now, often failing, and they put in charter applications to try to run the school. So on one hand, this is phenomenal. I mean, you have community members who want to make a change. We're moving past the traditional battles of union, non-union, and you have people saying, we want to own this, we want to change this. We have our charter authorizing process goes through NACSA, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. So it's fairly apolitical. So I do trust that process is working, in that there are problems with their applications and they haven't been improved. But it's still very hard to say to somebody who has such noble intentions and has such history in that community that, no, you can't do this. And by the way, this entrepreneur from New York that New Schools for New Orleans found is going to do it instead. Like, that's just hard. And you have to acknowledge that. I don't know the answer. What I can think about is we're not finding the right place for everybody on the bus in doing this. And again, this is part of a professionalization of the system. While I think the intentions are really, really great, if you had a failing hospital, 5 of us wouldn't say, oh, let's go start a hospital and we'll make one that's better, because we don't know how to do that. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be involved. We shouldn't give input on what this hospital looks like, what services it provides, where it's located. Those are all community decisions. It's unclear to me that the actual operation of the entity should be driven by community representation or professional expertise. Obviously, in an ideal world, you want both, but if you're making hard choices, tensions are going to rise. I don't think it's an easy issue, but that's somewhat how we think about it.
I read the same article this morning, and it's been on my mind since then. And I think it's a great question. I think one opportunity that we have to try to respond to that, and I will echo Nerev's sentiments that I don't have the answer for sure. But one of the things that I think we have an opportunity to take advantage of with our incubator is our desire. I think the common phrase these days is, how do we move away from Superman towards super friends? And I think with our incubator, we have this opportunity to say, we don't necessarily need to identify one person who's going to lead this charge. That can be very off-putting if that person isn't from Indianapolis or from X community or a member of X church. But instead, what if a great entrepreneur or a couple entrepreneurs partnered with the Urban League or partnered with United Way in Indianapolis or 100 Black Men of Indianapolis and came together to form an application? So that, maybe those team of leaders came from Indianapolis, maybe they didn't, but we've got folks who are coming together, some of whom are from Indianapolis, maybe some aren't. But I think that is a potential way that we can alleviate this idea of someone swooping in and saying, I'm going to fix things, I know how to do this better than you do, which is many times wrong and certainly offensive many times as well.
So Nelson, I would actually split up your question. I think the transition to a market that supports both choice and quality is just hard. I think when you're working with a lot of old ideas and old benchmarks, to try to change the paradigm a little bit and establish a higher set of benchmarks for new schools coming in and saying, this is what quality looks like now, that evolution is something that's going to take a lot of people to buy into over a long period of time. And I know the Alliance has been talking about quality for many, many years, and I think that's one part of your answer is, how do we ratchet up the expectations? And it's not just from the community groups, it's from everybody. And I think we're doing it through vehicles like the Walton funding, we're doing it through the CSP grant funding, we're doing it through our work. But the incubation work that we're doing is really a way to capitalize on that new level of expectation and inject energy into the market quickly.
I think, I share those sentiments. It's a challenging and politically charged issue. We've certainly seen it in Rhode Island, where we recently decided not to move a charter application forward that some local folks had brought to us. And I think that one of the places, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on this, one of the places where we've fallen down, and we're very actively trying to address this now, is in not articulating on the front end really what our philosophy is about what works, about what great public schools look like, why they get great outcomes. And so we've recently tried to start just being very public and transparent about that, to say, look, if you don't have very specific hiring practices and vetting practices that are going to lead to talented, hardworking, mission-aligned people in every classroom, if you can't flex your schedule to the needs of your students and have a longer day and year if you need it, if you don't have really deep and detailed thoughts about creating a culture of high expectations in your buildings, we're not interested. And come back when you have those things. because we think that that's what's actually going to lead to the kind of student outcomes that we're looking for. So it seems like from an incubator perspective, but also in the ed reform community generally, just being much more clear about what our philosophies are, and they don't all have to be the same, could be helpful to sort of managing the local politics of charter school growth.
Glinda, do you want to?
No, it was. Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, I'm Glinda Partee with the Center for American Progress. As incubators, or as you select the talent for the incubators, how attuned are you to market demand? And I say that because a lot of school districts have some good schools. It's just the ones that are in demand, there's never enough supply of them. They may not be innovative schools, but they're just good basic schools. They may be thematic kinds of schools, but you don't have enough of them. Do you consider that when you start to identify the talent and focus of the schools and people that you bring in?
Yeah, we've recently shifted to a replacement strategy. So as part of trying to turn around the bottom 5%, we're actually going into the places where we think kids are already at that are being underserved. So in some sense, the students are there, the adults aren't getting the jobs done for one reason or the other, and we're going there, which is a little different. So, and it's probably a little more heavy-handed. We're not opening up a school next to the failing school and recruiting the kids out, which is another way to do it. We're actually changing the adult management of the school. That's the strategy we've taken over the past couple of years, which changes how you approach the demand issue a little bit.
In Minneapolis, last year there were 40 charter schools that represented about an 18% market share of the public students. And I think what we've learned is that that market share number is misleading, because it doesn't matter what the absolute market share is in a district if the schools that are offered aren't providing the kind of quality that we expect or are delivering a better outcome than other schools that are available to those families. So our belief is we want to get to that tipping point where policy starts to change, where attitudes start to change. And I don't know that we're using a demand-based model so much as a supply push to kind of get to that point. And when you hear examples of New Orleans as an anomaly, I get, almost 80%, or DC 40% market share. I mean, there's room to grow, but as we do this growth, it's got to be growth focused on high-quality seats and not just more schools, more seats.
I think your question's really interesting because it not only asks how do we make sure that we're doing this strategically, but I think the deeper question is who makes sure that this growth of charter schools is happening strategically. And one of the things that I've realized and the Mind Trust has realized is that one of the qualities of great entrepreneurs is that they seize on an opportunity that they have, even if that in the context of, let's say, Indianapolis, might not make the most sense for growth of charter schools. And so I think it's very clear that that is our responsibility to make sure we have a really clear understanding of what the need is throughout Indianapolis. And we would never say you must place your school here, but making it clear, here is where the need is. Here is where there are lots of seats that are needed for high-quality public school options. And thinking broadly about Indianapolis, which is broken out into 11 different townships, almost each one of which has its own school district, thinking expansively and helping folks say, I know you're thinking about seizing an opportunity, but think strategically about where that demand is and where those great schools are needed.
This is interesting because the charter school program 10 years ago when I began, and Fordham actually authorizes charter schools in Ohio. The idea was that the authorizers would be the ones who would be the quality control agents and kind of have say on who got their foot in the door. So I see this, is it fair to say, I guess this is my question, is this supplemental to what authorizers do, and you see yourselves as working with authorizers and basically building on the lessons of how hard this is and saying it's not enough to just say, hey, if you have a great idea, come to us, we'll give you a contract and best of luck in going out and get the money. I mean, you're taking this to another level that's a lot more strategic and developed. And is this kind of like then the second generation of charter schooling? Or, I mean, how do you see this, and kind of help us understand the connection to one idea would be, to Al's point, man, well, you've been at this for 20 plus years in Minnesota, and it sounds like you haven't had many very good schools, and you could see a negative take on this. So how is this actually an advancement and a positive?
Well, Terry, Ohio and Minnesota have similar authorizer laws. Our two states allow for a lot of different types of authorizers. I view authorizers as partners in this work, and that as we say we need more high-quality charter schools, we are also saying we need more high-quality authorizers and more high-quality authorizer capacity to support and sponsor these schools. Because if these schools end up with authorizers that aren't going to hold them accountable, it's for naught again. And I think we will have wasted an opportunity to create great schools for our kids. So it is important. I think your point is well taken, and it's important for us to continue to develop authorizers as we are developing our own leaders and so forth. I mean, it's all part of the system, and it's one of those policy conditions that I think we need to continue to keep our eye on as well.
I've been having conversations with charter school leaders across the country who are in a place where they've been highly successful and they're looking to expand, and they want to do it in a really fertile ground. And at the end of one of these conversations, jumping off both of your points, he actually turned the tables and he said, when you look nationally, who would you say are the best authorizers? Who would you point to as really the standard bearers? And I thought that was a fascinating question to really look at how much charter schools care about the quality of their authorizer. And I was really intrigued to see that there is a bit of authorizer shopping when folks are thinking about where they're being placed. I think, to your point about like second generation, I certainly think it would be presumptuous of me and the Mind Trust to claim that moniker for ourselves, since we're just getting into this game. But I hope we are, I think aspirationally, we are a second check on quality to make sure that the folks that we're bringing in are strategic for Indianapolis and are going to be great options. I think that assuming an authorizer is operating phenomenally successfully, there is a bit of redundancy, which I am fine with in that, because of how important we know quality is.
I think this goes back to getting the rules right for everybody. And for me, the authorizer is a governmental function that is super important. And I'm not an expert in authorization, but my instincts has always been multiple authorizers is not the greatest idea. And I've been very comfortable with generally going through one authorizer in the state, and perhaps one in each city. But I think I'd even be okay with just a single state authorizer in every state. And the rest of the work should be pushed out. It'd be like making the SEC a venture fund. Like the SEC's job, whether they've done it well or not, is to set the rules and make sure everybody's following the rules. It's not to start banks and start companies and so forth. The authorizer's job should be to set the rules, make sure everybody's following the rules, and it should be entrepreneurs, incubators, and so forth who are doing the building of these organizations.
Hi. On? Can you hear me? Sorry. Rachel Scott from the Finance Project, and I'm wondering if you can see any role for the independent or mom and pop kind of charter schools within incubators, or those who just kind of have a unique idea and they're not necessarily interested in corporatizing what they do?
Well, our fellows are starting up their own individual charter schools. So if that's what you meant by mom and pop, we are not prescribing up front that they come in and start a network or start scale their own model. Our hope is to figure out the formula on the front end. How do we develop the right leaders? And then at some point we may create another pathway for those who want to start, network schools. But right now it's really just individual startups for us in Minnesota.
I think I'm actually fascinated to watch where the Mind Trust is heading in terms of launching CMOs from the start. We've only done this twice out of ours. Most of ours have been launching mom and pops, some of them who stayed as mom and pop, some of whom have grown. I think if the Mind Trust can get it right, maybe this is version 3, because I think it will lead to scale quicker. I think the trickier part is the models that they're looking at the Yes, the Ideas, the Noble Streets all started as one school. So it's how can you take what they did and predict on the front end to get to scale quicker, which is why I'm glad you're doing it. We expect to learn a lot from you guys on version 3.
Yeah, and I think that, to your question, is exactly what makes our incubator, sorry, I can't see you, is what makes our incubator very different, because we are not as interested then in the mom and pop who want to be one school forever. We really are looking to find the folks that want to build into a network.
Yeah, Lawrence Bussey, President of Alliance of Equity and Diversity in Education. Here's my question. Who do you want to incubate? Do you want to incubate the innovator, entrepreneur, or do you want to incubate the parents and community? Because most charter schools, when they run into difficulty, when they fail, it's because of either management problems or it's because of governance. So my question is, your focus on the innovator, the entrepreneur is fine, but if you don't focus on the total leadership package, that is the parents, the community, the entrepreneur, the innovator, it's not going to work, and what you start is not going to be sustainable.
I think that's an excellent point. I think one of the challenges we've heard from regional networks trying to come into different markets is their inability to just sort of drop a new box into the market and get the community to buy into it. So, one of the reasons we've expanded or extended our fellowship program to 2 years is so that the fellow has a year to build the relationship with the community before they actually open the school, because we think that's missing in many cases. And in the old model, the charter school was typically board-led, and they were working off a very compressed timetable. In our model, it's a leader-led fellow, and they have more time to do the work to actually build a school that is going to meet the specific needs of the community they're trying to serve. So it's got to be a two-way process.
I don't have anything to add other than you are absolutely right with the point that you're making, and it just raises the stakes for how successful and how well the execution has to be, and the ability for the folks that are either local to Indianapolis or that we bring in building that community for wherever their school is located. Absolutely.
I'd like to talk about the relationships for the candidates that you bring in as your leaders. Is there a mentoring protocol, especially when you're talking about schools that are on the high end versus those at the lower end? I would think that if you had such innovators, that there would be an expectation for the exchange. And with that exchange, what are you doing with regards to sustainability?
Just to clarify, sorry,
Sure,
do you mean exchange within the folks who are incubated, or between the incubator and?
Incubators and then the schools themselves.
Gotcha. Okay.
Great. So a couple things on that. I think when possible, incubating in cohorts is just a useful thing, and I think this is potentially the promise of regional incubators. In a city, you might only be doing 1 or 2 or 3 a year. The Kip Fisher Fellowship can get a group of 12 to 15 people, and I think there's something very powerful about going through training in a cohort. A lot of organizations from the Army on down socialize in cohorts for that bonding and learning experience. So that, I think, is important if you can have the scale to do it. In our case, we were doing cohorts of 4, which got us some of that. Whether it was getting beers, coffee shop, or more formal, there was a lot of that going on. And we also did school reviews where they would visit each other's schools. The one thing I think we found that didn't happen is the transmission from high to low. Oftentimes the schools that weren't working were because the leaders weren't ready to lead, and they could have, the 10 commandments of how to run a great charter school, and it just wasn't going to get them over the hump of not really being prepared, which was on us for selecting them. So we didn't put a ton of energy in thinking that our best folks could get our underperforming folks up, though we tried, and that can be useful. You also have to be careful. The high-performing folks are still working harder than they ever have in their life, and how much can you expect on them to also help somebody else as well can be tricky.
I'm not sure if this is exactly what you meant, but one of the relationships that we've tried to create in our program is the relationship between the fellow and an existing charter school leader in our community. So, you know, we want to help our existing schools get better, but we also want to start new schools. And what we've found is by combining those two, we're actually accomplishing both with one program, if you will. And so our fellows are in a residency school program for the entire first year while they're developing their business plan and their authorizer app, et cetera. And during that year, they're assigned work to actually improve the academic outcomes of the host resident school. But in return, what we're asking that resident school to provide is high exposure to interactions with the board, interaction with parents and staff, a leadership role in that resident school so that they can learn what it actually takes to be a great leader. And at the same time, they're giving back as well. So we've created that, I think, a unique relationship between our fellows and the schools. I'd love to be able to find a way to do that with the business community in the second year, because what makes a charter school leader skill set so unique is it's a combination of managing a school and managing a multi-million-dollar business operation. And so often we hear of the schools failing because of the financial piece. And if we could create a residency or an internship program with business partners like we are with school or education partners, then I think we've got a better shot at making this work.
Other questions, comments?
Brian,
What about-
for context, I mean, you talked about SIG dollars early. How much money are we talking there? I mean, put this into the context of how much the feds are putting out each year in terms of SIG dollars, and if you wanted to allocate a percentage of that to get to real money, what percentage are we talking about here?
Well, the SIG dollars, of course, have been temporarily increased significantly into the multi-billions because of the stimulus, and that's not a long-term. That's probably not a long-term funding stream. But even if you were talking about a half $1 billion, if we're talking about $500,000 to incubate a charter school, then it's not a significant portion. And if schools are spending about $2.5 million now per SIG grant, you could imagine a process where you took $500,000 of that and used it to incubate the leader who was going to do the restart, and that would still leave $2 million for the kinds of activities that are currently being done with SIG dollars. So it seems like a real opportunity. Whether it can fit within the state policies and the federal regulations is another question, but it seems like a question worth forcing because we could really have some different outcomes if we were able to reallocate in that way. So we've reached the end of our time. I want to ask you to join me in thanking the panelists for giving us this talk, and appreciate it.